Good evening and welcome to Bible Basics with Pastor Steve. And tonight we are going to be talking about Samson and Delilah, finally reaching part 3 of our section on Samson and moving in on the end of the book of Judges. Hey, Jeff and Kathy are here. Sandy is here. Yes, please say hello. If you have any questions tonight, please put them into the chat. I did not receive any via email. You're always welcome to send me questions or suggestions via email. Use the one... Pictures backwards for me. It's always confusing. Use that email to send me any questions or comments or observations or suggestions about the study. Good evening, John. Good evening, Mike and Kim. We were off last week, so we're back. I had a week of vacation, though there will be a couple more weeks later on in the summer. One in mid-July and one in mid-August. I don't remember the dates off the top of my head. That's not how my mind works. So, each week we're doing one critical story from the Bible, a story that I think everybody needs to know if they want to have a good understanding of God through the book He gave us. And if you want to receive that paraphrasing, I will send it to you on Tuesday afternoons to remind you that we're having study on Tuesday evenings. And I got today's out a little bit later than I wanted to because MailChimp was down. Nothing I can do about it. So I had to wait till after I gave blood, gave double reds. So my mind... I don't have quite enough red blood cells at the moment, so I don't know how that's going to affect the study tonight. Good evening, Barbara. Barbara did a little bit of heroic running around today. Appreciate that, Barbara. I'll let you tell the story yourself sometime, though. But I wanted people to know that you've got a story to tell. I think that's it. Oh, don't forget, if you have not yet, hit like or subscribe on YouTube or on Facebook. The easiest way to catch up with any classes that you've missed is to have them in your feed if you've got a YouTube account. And if you don't have a YouTube account, I strongly recommend it. I use it all the time. All right, let's go ahead and start with the word of prayer. Good evening, Charles. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, for you alone are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So, moving into Judges chapter 16 finally, and you may remember that I said 2 weeks ago that there were 2 paragraphs at the beginning of chapter 16, and when I say they're paragraphs, remember that the paragraph breaks are modern insertions. The text didn't originally have them. In most modern Bibles, there's 2 paragraphs at the beginning of chapter 16 that I thought maybe we should group with chapter 15. The chapter numbers are also modern edits. And I decided, no, we'll go ahead and put them with chapter 16 because I think it's really a story unto itself. But I think it serves as a better prologue to this story than postlude to the previous story. So, here we go with chapter 16, the book of Judges. One day, Samson went to Gaza. He found a prostitute and spent the night with her. When the locals found out he was there, they decided to kill him first thing in the morning. They set up an ambush at the city gates and waited for sunrise. But Samson got up to leave at midnight. The city gate was closed for the night, so he grabbed hold of it and ripped the whole frame out of the ground. He hoisted the structure over his shoulder and carried it all the way to the top of the hill at Hebron. When he dropped it there, the doors were still locked closed within the frame. That's the end of that story. Prologue to this story. Later on, Samson fell in love with a woman who lived in the valley of Sorek. Her name was Delilah. The Philistine leaders went to her and said, "Use your feminine wiles on him. Find out what makes him so strong and what his weakness is so we can capture him. If you do, we'll each give you 1,100 silver coins." The next time Delilah saw Samson, she asked, "What makes you so strong? If I wanted to tie you up, how would I do it? Please, tell me." Samson said, "I'm vulnerable to new bowstrings that haven't been dried yet. If someone tied me up with those, I would be just as weak as anybody else." So the Philistines gave Delilah 7 green bowstrings and hid some men in her house. When Samson came to visit, she tied him up and then yelled, "The Philistines are attacking!" He snapped the strings like they were scorched thread. Delilah said, "You liar! You've made a fool of me. Now tell me the truth. What would it really take to tie you up?" He said, "You would need rope. New rope that's never been used." The next time Samson visited, they tried again. Soldiers were hidden in her house while she tied him up, but once again, when she shouted, he easily snapped the ropes. Delilah said, "You're mocking me. Come on, tell me how to tie you up." He said, "You'd need to tie up my hair. If you take my braids and weave them into a loom and nail the loom to the wall, then I'll be helpless." Delilah waited for Samson to fall asleep, and then she tied his hair up in the loom. The loom was already embedded in the floor, and she nailed it to the wall too. When she shouted, "The Philistines are attacking!" he bolted upright. His hair pulled the loom right out of the floor and off the wall. Delilah pleaded with him. "You don't really love me. You say you do, but you've lied to me 3 times now. I still don't know the secret of your strength." She pleaded with him day and night until he couldn't take it anymore. Finally, she wore him down, and he told her his secret. "I'm a Nazirite. I was dedicated to God at birth. I've never cut my hair or shaved my beard." I lost my place. I've never cut my hair or shaved my beard. If I lose my hair, I lose my strength." Delilah knew he was telling the truth this time, so she sent word to the Philistine leaders, "Come to the house one more time. I know his secret." So they came with the money they had promised. That night, as Samson slept with his head in her lap, she called for the men to shave his head. As they cut his hair, his strength drained out of him. Once again she shouted, "Samson, the Philistines are here!" Not realizing that God had left him, Samson thought, "Here we go again." This time he couldn't break free. They plucked out his eyes, locked him in bronze chains, and put him to work at the prison mill. But they made the mistake of letting his hair grow back. The Philistine leaders gathered their people to celebrate at the temple of Dagon. There were about 3,000 men and women. They offered a great sacrifice and rejoiced, saying, "Our God has delivered our enemy Samson into our hand." They had Samson brought up out of prison for their entertainment. A young boy led him by the hand, and he performed for them. After they'd had their laughs, Samson asked the boy to lead him to a pillar so he could rest against it. As he felt the pillars with his hands, he prayed, "Lord God, remember me and give me strength just one more time so I can have my revenge." Samson was standing between the 2 pillars in the center of the temple. He put one hand on each and shouted, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed against the pillars with all his might, and the temple came crashing down on all of them. He killed more in death than he had in life. Samson's family came and retrieved his body so he could be buried in his father's tomb. He had judged Israel for 20 years. This is the word of our Lord and the story of Samson. Now, I do want to say that when I was paraphrasing this, I made the decision to use the phrase, "use your feminine wiles on him." Most of the English paraphrasing say something like, trick him or coax the information out of him. But I went, so that phrasing is definitely not in the original text. But, I'm trying to rewrite this as we would tell a story in modern English. And that's clearly the trope that they're following here, right? I'm not reading the Delilah trope back onto Delilah. She invented it, okay? So she is clearly using her relationship and her sexuality to get this information out of him. So I went ahead and used the phrase feminine wiles. don't blame me for sexist language. It's a sexist story. But man, so she ties him up. She tied him up 3 times. Or 4 times, I guess the 4th time it's not clear whether there was any tying up involved. But she says, tell me how to tie you up so you can't get out. And he tells her, and she ties him up. And he lets her tie him up. So they had an interesting relationship. Oh, my goodness. Obviously, she cared more about money than she cared about him. Some people have, of course, speculated that she too was a prostitute. It doesn't say that. She might have been. That would definitely be in character for Samson, apparently. So, what are we going to say about this story? Well, first, a recap. I've said the last couple of weeks that I'm in the school of thought that Samson's story is intentionally told comedically as a moment of lighthearted relief to give us a break before going into the final chapters of Judges. And there is one more, I'll say, normal story before we get into the real grisly stuff. So we just finished chapter 16, and 17 and 18, the text is, nothing extraordinary happens in that text. But then we get into chapter 19, and chapters 19 through 21. Those are the chapters that I've said are the nastiest chapters in the Bible, the most grisly. So I do believe that Samson's certainly told in a way that's intentionally funny. I do believe, though, that there is purpose to his story beyond that, which is to once again bolster the argument that Israel is not going to be able to survive as a tribal federation. So up through Judges and into 1st and 2nd Samuel, Israel has been a tribal federation, 12 tribes, each tribe governing itself, all worshiping the Lord God of Israel, all also flirting with the other gods in the local Canaanite pantheon, all following the same religious cultural structure, but only uniting together when they needed to fight a common threat. And there were times when the threat was not common. In other words, some tribes were threatened more than others, that they didn't really come together at all. So when we get into the story of Samuel, who is the last of the judges, and we're not there yet, we've got other stuff first, the people want to abandon this tribal federation structure, and they want to be a true nation and to have a king like other nations. Now, Samuel is opposed to that. He says God is supposed to be their king. They shouldn't need any other king. And God says some things that support Samuel on that. But there's a legitimate argument within the text here. Not everybody is willing to see that. People who are of the mind that God dictated all of this, dictated the entire Bible, all of the books of the Bible. They don't all say that, by the way. In fact, some of them specifically say that the writer had a vision and is struggling to find the words to relay the vision. So it is not the case that the Bible was all dictated by God. Parts of it were. Most of it was not. At least most of it doesn't say that it was. People who treat the whole thing as if it was dictated by God want to look at the whole book as if it is God's perspective, that it is God's voice we're hearing everywhere. And that is simply not the case. Multiple voices are preserved in the scriptures, and they were preserved intentionally for us so that we could see the people arguing over what God's will actually is. Does God want us to continue to be a tribal federation and with only God as king? Or is it really the case that this is not working? Okay, so once again, we're not going to cover chapters 19 through 21. If you want to go ahead and read those, you can, but just understand that they are very violent. There is sexual violence. There is gore. It's unlike anything else you've read thus far in the Bible, unless you've already read this section. And then it ends with a verse that relay something that has been said previously in Judges, which was, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes, which is to say that, and it doesn't work. When everyone does what is right in their own eyes, terrible things can happen because everybody thinks that they've got God on their side. So that I do believe that that Samson is a portion of that, because yes, Samson has been chosen by God and is being used by God. Does that mean God approves of everything Samson does? I think you'd have a hard time making that argument. At least if you make that argument, I'm going to argue with you. So what does this tell us about God? Well, I'll say this. If God can use Samson, God can use anyone. Because Samson is a very flawed individual who nonetheless is one of the heroes of the Bible. What does this tell us about ourselves? And I'm going to have to sort of handle that question together with the next question, is what does this tell us about our relationships with each other and with God? The gender relationships in this story, the way Samson relates to women. He wants a Philistine woman because he saw her from a distance and he liked the way she looked. He went to a town, saw a prostitute, spent the night with her, falls in love with Delilah, who was clearly not looking out for his best interests, clearly in it for her own gain. And Samson makes all the wrong choices when it comes to women. And perhaps because of that, he has the women who will take advantage of that way of life have a way of finding their way to Samson. Different personality types have a tendency to gravitate toward each other, even when those types are mutually destructive. And that is the case here with Samson. And nothing that Samson does is excused by the actions of his Philistine wife's family, or by the actions of the prostitute, or by the actions of Delilah. Nothing done by any of these women or their families or their nations justifies the way Samson acts. And likewise, nothing that Samson does justifies the behavior of any of the people that he comes in contact with. Well, I guess you could argue that after he burned all their fields and killed so many people, maybe you say that they're justified in wanting to have him killed as well. But the Philistines are the bad guy in this story. They're persecuting and oppressing the Israelite people. So we're not going to go there. What does this story then tell us about our relationships with each other? And where I was going with that was, there's a brokenness in our sexuality that is revealed in the way men and women relate to each other, and the way men and women sometimes use each other. I'm not saying that every man and every woman does that, but there clearly is a pattern at play in human history that goes way back to the beginning of human civilization and continues in our culture today. That's part of the brokenness of humanity. And I'm wording it that way because I'm very intentionally not saying this is just who we are, because that's dismissive of it, and it absolves us of culpability. We're broken because we broke the planet. We broke ourselves. God didn't make us this way. This is part of our brokenness. Is it part of who we are? Yeah, it is, but it wasn't supposed to be. And if we believe in the transforming power of God, then it doesn't have to be who we are. So what does this tell us about our relationships with each other and with God? I want to focus on the hair in answer to that question, because I've known people, and there have been times when I myself were troubled by the plot element in which Samson's hair growing back seems to restore his strength, because they're very deliberate to say that they didn't stop to think maybe we should keep shaving his head while he's in prison, and they let his hair grow back. It points that out to us. And so people read this and say, Well, this is functioning more like magic than it is like the will of God. God had blessed him with his strength, and he lost his strength when he apparently broke his Nazirite vow. And so that implies that it's Samson's fault that she had them shave his hair, right? So, so he broke his vow, head got shaved, he loses his strength, God revokes the blessing. But if the strength comes back when his hair grows back, that's how magic works. That's not how the Word of God works, or that's not how the grace of God works. Looking at it now at a different place in life, I'm thinking, well, maybe it is the way God works, because yes, it is very specific to say that the hair grows back, but maybe that's not directly connected to the strength. Maybe his hair growing back is a symbol, or is symbolic for us, because we damage ourselves over life, other people damage us throughout life, but healing can take place. And his eyes are not going to grow back. Not everything grows back, but hair does grow back. Not every wound heals, but some of them do. And with that healing then comes the opportunity to re-engage God. So maybe in his broken state, he should not have been given his strength back, but after a period of time, and we don't know how long this is, we just know that his hair is growing back. He plays the weakness card, like he's now an older man. Maybe I've always pictured him being older at this point, but the way the story flows, that they're thanking God for the deliverance from Samson, would indicate that maybe it hasn't been that long. Maybe he's just got stubble starting to grow back. We don't know, but maybe with some distance from the event, maybe now that he's healed a little bit, maybe now that he's grown a little bit, maybe he's in a place now where he can have the strength back, because at least now he's thinking, okay? Because the old Samson, if his strength just grew back with his hair, he'd have broken out of jail maybe. He's blind, maybe he wouldn't have gotten far, but he certainly would not have performed on demand in the temple of Dagon. That's not who Samson used to be, but he does. He lets a child lead him by the hands, utterly humiliated, into this temple, and allows himself to be the laughingstock of the people, and then has the forethought, more forethought than he has ever shown in the story thus far, saying, why don't you take me over to one of the pillars? All the ancient temples had pillars, not just the Greek temples, because big structures, they didn't have arches, they didn't have other architectural techniques to hold up big ceilings, so they had to have pillars everywhere if they wanted to have a big room. So he knew there would be pillars there, and so with the forethought to say, put me against one of the pillars, then he's like, okay, now I'm in position. But then he doesn't just knock it over. He asks God to give him the strength for one more feat, one more act of vengeance against his enemies. We can debate the morality of that. God has not yet said, vengeance is mine, right? And then he knocks it over. So I'm going to say that his strength did not return with his hair. It says his hair grew back. It doesn't say his strength came back. His strength came back when he asked God to give it back to him. And that gave him the opportunity to die a hero's death. So I think that the hair growing back was symbolic that even though he has been captured, even though he has been blinded, God has not yet completely turned his back on Samson. And So the hair growing back is God's way of saying, "Hey, Samson, I'm still here. You gonna end your days in prison, or are you gonna do what you were supposed to do all along, which was end this threat that the Philistines have against our people?" So that's our discussion for the week on the book of Judges. Next week, we will move into the book of Ruth. I'm not sure how many weeks we'll spend in Ruth, although there will be a break in there when I go on vacation again. I think I know I'm going to break it into at least 2 weeks. Ruth really reads as one story straight through. If you want to sit and read the book, you can read the book in one sitting, and that's the way it should be done. But I don't think we can discuss it that way. It's too long for that. So I'm going to break it into at least 2 pieces, maybe 3. Really, you could probably argue that it could be broken into 4, but I don't know. I'll play it by ear. We'll wing it. So moving on to the news. First of all, some Methodist news from United Methodist Insight, United Methodist Insight, the website. They inform us that down in Arkansas, there was a church, the former First United Methodist Church of Jonesboro, had sued the conference. They had withdrawn from the denomination. They had not done it properly. They asked the court to award them a quick release, a quick deed to all of their property. They lost the case, and all of the property will be retained by the Arkansas Annual Conference. And this is a large church campus covering multiple square blocks in downtown Jonesboro. In other news, and this one's more interesting, I don't think we've talked about this organization since I've been here. I've talked about it in the past, I think, in this Bible study. The organization called the Institute for Religion and Democracy. It's a very conservative group that exists for the purpose of advocating for conservative political ideology within American church structures. So, there has been reports that it is funded by a conservative faction within the Roman Catholic Church. So, if that is the case, then it is Catholics funding an organization that exists for the purpose of making Protestant denominations more conservative culturally and politically. It's both. So that's the Institute for Religion and Democracy. And so it's active in various denominations, including the Methodist Church. And for some time, the branch that is active in the Methodist Church has been led by a fellow named John Lamperis, who writes for Juicy Ecumenism, which is not ecumenical at all. It is the newsletter of that organization, the IRD, and he has written several articles for them that let's just say they were of questionable factual accuracy in regarding to how it reported events in the United Methodist Church. But he was elected as a lay delegate to General Conference. But the church that he came out of, those delegates are elected at Annual Conference. Members of the Annual Conference. So the way it works is congregations have members, send lay members to annual conferences. Ours this year was Cindy Brown. Those lay members can then be elected to serve as delegates from the annual conference to the general conference. So his congregation sent him to the annual conference, which was the Indiana Annual Conference. What will the conference do with a large church like Jonesboro? I'll get back to that in a minute, Sandy. All right, so this guy, Lamperis, was sent by his congregation to annual conference, and annual conference elected him to be a delegate to general conference. Okay, so he would have been representing the conservative faction. But then the congregation that sent him to annual conference withdrew from the United Methodist Church. So he transferred his membership to another congregation, that was to another Methodist congregation, which then also withdrew, and then he transferred it to another Methodist. This has happened several times now, okay? So he's helping congregations withdraw from the denomination, then going to a new congregation, doing it over and over again, all the while, on paper, a delegate to General Conference. And in the middle of all of this, he moved to a different state. I forget which state he moved to, but he's no longer even in the same state as the Indiana Annual Conference. And he claims there's nothing wrong with this, that people do this all the time. That is not exactly true, okay? It's common for it's common for clergy people to serve to serve outside of their annual conference. So, for example, we have pastors serving in this conference and pastors teaching at Wesley Seminary, which is located in this conference, who are members of other annual conferences, and they're considered to be on loan to this conference in some cases. If they're serving in a church here, they're considered on loan. If they're teaching in an extension ministry, then they're not considered to be on loan. They're just members of their annual conference. But none of them vote in this annual conference. They vote in their home conferences. And generally speaking, when their employment here ends, they go back there. Or if they decide they like it here, then they transfer their membership here. But that's not the case for lay people. Lay people are not on loan to another conference. They don't serve in that way. He's supposed to be serving a congregation in Indiana. So at the Indiana annual conference this year, somebody made a motion to remove him as a delegate since he had this pattern of behavior that was troubling, and because he was no longer physically located, but wasn't even actually attending the annual conference gathering this year. And it turns out there's no procedure in the discipline for removing a delegate. It's never come up before, apparently. It's hard to imagine that it couldn't come up before. You know what? I'm sure it's come up before. Back during the Civil War era, when the church divided over slavery, this must have come up. But it never made its way into policy in any official capacity. So somebody just made the motion, I move that we remove this guy. And there was a lot of discussion about it, and in the end they did by 62%. I wouldn't be surprised if he tries to take legal action over that, at least in a church court. But I don't know. We'll see. In other news, according to the Pew Research Center, a recent survey showed that about a quarter of United States adults regularly watch religious services on TV or online. And of course, those of us who are streaming only at home, all the TV we watch is technically online. Of the quarter of the people in this country who are watching church online and on television, most are very satisfied with their online experience, but would still prefer to be physically present if they could be. All right, moving on to, that was the news from uminsight.com. Now we're moving on to religionnews.com. We talked before about how Saddleback Church, which was made famous by Rick Warren, who was its founding pastor and served there for over 30 years. He's the guy who wrote the book, The Purpose-Driven Life. He also wrote a book before that called The Purpose-Driven Church, which I thought was also quite good. He's very Calvinist, and whenever I teach Purpose-Driven Life in churches, I have to do some correction on that. But so when he retired, he was replaced by a couple, and the couple, the husband and wife, co-pastor the church, and they hired some other female pastors, and for that reason they were being expelled from the Southern Baptist Convention. They appealed that to the general body so that the actual members had to vote at their annual convention, and their expulsion was upheld by the membership by a solid majority. Rick Warren fought the battle on their behalf, and was asked afterwards what his response to it was, and he said that he expected to lose. He said that he didn't think they had any chance of winning that vote. But he went on to say that they got many more votes in their favor than he had expected. I think he said 700 more votes on Saddleback's side than he expected, and he considered that to be a victory. And he also said that, in the long run, truth always wins out over tradition. So that was a very hopeful word, a very gracious word, I think, from Rick Warren. I've always liked that guy. I don't agree with everything he says, but he's very likable, and I think his heart's in the right place. Last but not least, this weekend is, I'll call it the 4th of July weekend. Of course, 4th of July isn't until Tuesday, but this is the weekend that's closest to the 4th of July. And on that weekend, I Not always, but I usually preach a sermon that in some way relates to that. And this year I will be preaching a sermon about what it means for a Christian to be a good citizen. And I might even dive into what does it mean for a Methodist to be a good citizen. We'll see. So getting back to Sandy's question, what will the conference do with a large church like that in Jonesboro? Well, they haven't said, okay? The most likely scenario is that they will attempt to start a new congregation on that campus. If there are any disgruntled members from Jonesboro, the former First Church, that did not want to leave the denomination, they would be the first people they would approach. We'll send in a new church plant pastor and attempt to start a new congregation in that facility. That's what we did the last time this happened. There was a real big stink in this conference many years ago now. It was the late 90s, early noughts. It was the late 90s, early noughts when Resurrection Prayer Worship Center, which was a very large congregation in our conference, withdrew, and there was a legal battle, and our conference won and got to keep the property. So the people who left the congregation went off and took over an old shopping center and turned the department store into their new worship center. Now, that church had been a small country church that had received a charismatic pastor who blew it up into this giant congregation. And when he and his people left, the original congregation, what was left of them, stayed. So there was like 50 people left in this giant this giant facility that he had built. It was deeply, deeply in debt, mortgaged, and it wasn't just mortgaged to a bank. They had sold bonds to the members who would then, so the people who left are bondholders on the debt for this building, and they brought another charismatic pastor up. Great guy, great guy, very effective pastor, but he was put into the impossible situation of quickly building up a new congregation that could service this debt that this building had over it. And ultimately, they were unable to, and the bank seized the property because they were in foreclosure. They went into foreclosure, and the bank took the property back. And then the bank auctioned it, and the congregation that had left then bid at the auction to get their property back. And I believe they were awarded it. I know they were awarded it, but I don't think they ended up getting it. I think if memory serves, don't quote me on this, I don't think they were able to actually come up with the funds that they bid in that auction. But I could be wrong. I've tried to find out several times online how that played out, and I've been unable to figure it out. But it's a shame because those people lost the property that their ancestors were buried on. So what are they going to do in Jonesboro? They'll probably try to put a new church in there. I don't know that that's what they're going to try to do. Maybe they'll sell it. I don't know. I doubt they will, but they might. But given the state of Christianity in America, and given the climate that is probably built up around this lawsuit in that community, I think it's improbable that if that is their plan, it's not likely to succeed, unfortunately. I wish it could. That would be the happy ending that I would want from that story, but I just don't see it happening. All right. I don't see any other questions. We've got 5 people left online, and that's fine. I know some people will watch it later, and not everybody's interested in the news. People are more interested in the Bible portion than they are in the news, and that's probably for the best. All right, so we're going to go ahead, unless I see something come up into the chat, and I'm not seeing anything at the moment. And we're going to go ahead and close with a word of prayer in just a moment. Let's go ahead and close. God, give me the grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, the courage to change the things which should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other, living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. All right, brothers and sisters, that's all she wrote. Have a good week. I'll see you online or in